Have you ever wondered what happens if you make a deal with an organization that doesn't actually exist in the eyes of the law? Well, we're about to find out. Today we're digging into a Supreme Court case that starts with a bunch of airline tickets and ends with a pretty serious question. Who's going to pay the bill? This is the story of International Express Travel versus Henri Khan and the Philippine Football Federation.
Okay, so here's our game plan. First, we're going to walk through the facts, what actually happened. Then we'll get into the big legal question that had the lower courts tied in knots. After that, we'll look at the final verdict, break down why the Supreme Court decided the way it did, and finally unpack the major legal principle that this case established.
All right, let's set the stage. Every legal battle has an origin story, and this one starts with what seemed like a normal business transaction, one that went south and kicked off a legal fight that went all the way to the top. Really, it all boils down to this single question. I mean, what do you do when you're doing business with, well, a ghost? An entity that looks and acts real, but legally might not be. The answer to this is going to decide who's on the hook for a whole lot of money.
So here's how it all went down. In 1989, a travel agency hooks up the Philippine Football Federation with tickets for their teams to travel. Everything seems fine at first, but then the payments start to slow down. The PFF makes a couple of partial payments, but the debt keeps growing. And then, and this is a really key detail, the Federation's president, Henri Khan, cuts a personal check for 50,000 pesos. Remember that little fact because it's going to be a big deal later on. And this was the final number. Over 200,000 pesos. After sending demand letters and getting no more payments, the travel agency's hands were tied. They had to file a lawsuit.
Okay, so now we get to the real heart of this thing. The issue wasn't just about an unpaid bill anymore. It became a question of identity. Who, or what, exactly, was the Philippine Football Federation?
This is the million-dollar question, legally speaking. Did the PFF have juridical personality? In plain English, was it a real legal person that could be sued on its own, totally separate from the people who ran it? Or was it just a name, a front for its president, Henri Khan?
So you've basically got two totally different stories here. The travel agency is pointing the finger at Khan, saying you owe us this money. But Khan's defense is, hey, don't look at me. I was just an agent acting for the PFF, which is its own legal entity. The entire case hinged on figuring out which one it was.
And this, my friends, is where the legal roller coaster really takes off. The case bounced from one court to another, and believe me, each one had a completely different opinion on who was right.
So the first court, the trial court, sided with the travel agency. They looked at the evidence and said, look, there's no proof the PFF is a real corporation. So Khan, you've got to pay. But Khan appealed. And the Court of Appeals, they did a complete 180. They decided that yes, the PFF did have its own legal existence, which meant Henri Khan was off the hook.
So with two courts saying completely opposite things, there was only one place left to settle it, the Supreme Court. They took a look at everything, and their decision was decisive. The Court of Appeals, they said, got it wrong. The ruling was completely thrown out. And in the end, the Supreme Court brought it all back to the very beginning. They reinstated the original trial court's decision. And what does that mean? It means Henri Khan was, in fact, personally liable for the $207,524.20 debt, plus all the interest and attorney's fees.
So, you're probably asking, why? Why did the Supreme Court land on this decision? Well, let's dive into their logic, the why behind the verdict.
The Supreme Court laid it out in a pretty simple and elegant way. They said, sure, a sports group can become a corporation, but it doesn't just happen automatically. You have to go through the official process. You need formal recognition from the state. You need accreditation. And when they asked Henri Khan for proof for any document showing the PFF was accredited, he couldn't provide one. So the conclusion was simple. No proof, no corporation.
Now, this case wasn't just about settling one specific debt. It ended up creating a really important rule in business law, one that's still super relevant today. And here it is, the big takeaway. The Supreme Court made it crystal clear. If you go around acting like you represent a corporation, but that corporation doesn't actually have a valid legal existence, well, you can't just hide behind that fake entity. You personally become liable for the deals you make.
Now, the Court of Appeals had tried to use this legal idea called corporation by estoppel to let Khan off the hook. It's a bit complicated, but it basically says if you deal with an organization as if it's a corporation, you can't suddenly turn around and say it's not one just to get out of your obligations. But the Supreme Court pointed out that they were using it completely backwards.
And this is such a critical point. The doctrine of estoppel is meant to be a shield to protect people who were led to believe they were dealing with a real corporation. It's not a sword for the people who created the fiction to begin with. The travel agency wasn't trying to escape the contract, they were trying to enforce it, they just wanted to get paid. You can't use that rule against them.
So, after all that, what's the big lesson we can all take away from this? It's actually pretty simple, but incredibly important. Before you sign that contract, before you make that deal, do your homework. Make absolutely sure you know who or what is on the other side. Because if you don't, you might end up like the travel agency, trying to collect a debt from a ghost. And as this case proves, the only one left holding the bag is the person who signed the papers.